Good evening, everyone. God. It's a very wobbly thing, just to warn you. Good evening and welcome to this event to launch UK and a Changing Europe's latest report, which is a retrospective and a prospective on Brexit and the Brexit process. As you'll know, the evening is going to be divided into two parts. The second part will be a panel discussion largely about the report, what it says, what it doesn't say, what it's got right, and if you really want, what it might have got wrong. But to kick us off, I'm really, really delighted that we have Nick Thomas-Symonds, who has many, many titles, but the one that really matters as far as I'm concerned at the moment is Minister for Relations with the European Union. Nick's got 4 events this evening, and he's very, very kindly agreed to squeeze us in at the start of the evening. He'll talk for about 10, 15 minutes. He's got to dash to get to the next event, so he won't be taking questions. But Nick, I'm so grateful to you for finding the time. Thank you ever so much, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Pleasure. Well, thank you very much, Anand, and it really is a pleasure to join you all this evening. And before I begin on the main part of my remarks, I do want to thank UK in a Changing Europe for organising this event and for the important work so many of you in this room do in terms of driving investment and growth in the UK. And part of the reason I am grateful is that it is right that we use the anniversary of Brexit as an important point of reflection. And it is vital that these reflections are informed by evidence and research. After all, I should say, not all of us have had enough of experts. And the evidence is stark, that significant parts of the UK economy have been impacted by the Conservatives' Brexit deal that we inherited. And whilst cross-border regulation works well in some areas, there are far, far too many impediments to trade and growth. I don't often find myself quoting my political opponents, but I will on this occasion praise the Leader of the Opposition for her eloquence when she said, "The British people made it so clear in July that they wanted a change. We were making," she said, "announcements without proper plans. We announced that we would leave the European Union before we had a plan for growth outside the EU. Those mistakes were made because we told people what they wanted to hear first and then tried to work it out later." Now, party politics aside, that is a damning indictment of the situation that we inherited, and it shows as well why it is that we need to improve the status quo. So as we move forward, I have been determined to turn the page on a period of division and acrimony, to reinvigorating alliances and forging new partnerships with our European friends. The European Union is our largest trading partner, and whilst of course we will honour the Windsor Framework, we supported it in opposition, we also can't allow the status quo to continue. And that is why a closer, more cooperative relationship with the European Union is in the UK's national interest. And our manifesto provided a mandate for change and improvement. There are red lines of no return to freedom of movement, the customs union, or the single market. But it also recognised that the geopolitical environment today is very different. So many of the challenges that face us here in the United Kingdom also confront our neighbours and allies across Europe. The need to drive economic growth and dynamism, standing up to Russian aggression, seizing the opportunities of the green transition whilst maintaining our energy security or taking action on criminal gangs. In all of these areas, we have deep mutual interests with our EU friends. And that is why I see the pillars for the relationship reset as threefold: security, safety, and prosperity. Security: to keep the UK and the EU secure, we need to support allies like Ukraine and work with NATO and European partners on security. On safety: to protect our borders, we need to work with other countries to break up the vile global trade in human trafficking. And on prosperity: to grow the economy and boost living standards, we need to build export and investment opportunities for the UK and EU businesses and reduce barriers to trade. with our biggest trading partners. Now, on the economy, British business and the researcher is very clear. They are being held back by too much red tape. So it's clear to me that we need to tackle barriers to trade to help drive investment and create jobs and growth. And I know, and I say this particularly to those of you who are here this evening, who have long called for a more mature, realistic relationship between the UK and the EU. So I will read with interest the findings of this report, and I will continue to listen to the voices of people at the front line on this issue. Now, I am ambitious for this reset. And now that the Commission is in place, you will all see it being driven forward at even greater pace. Since coming into government, we've already had over 60 direct engagements between UK ministers and their EU counterparts, unquestionably changing the tone. And that is driven from the very top, with the Prime Minister meeting with the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, last year and agreeing to a formal summit in the first part of this year and to drive forward work in areas of mutual benefit, such as the economy, energy, security and resilience. Just before Christmas, a British Chancellor attended a meeting of EU finance ministers for the first time since Brexit. And my regular meetings with my counterpart and friend Maros Sefcovic are important as we make preparations for the summit and the negotiations around it. We're also making progress towards a new security and defence partnership with new 6-monthly foreign policy dialogues between the Foreign Secretary and the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs. And I have been delighted myself to secure the appointment of Michael Ellam as the second permanent secretary to the Cabinet Office. He is a first-class official, and his experience will be invaluable as we now move through the negotiations. Now, I am not a fantasist. I know there will be obstacles to this work. And indeed, if the last 5 years have taught us anything, it's that there will be issues that are difficult to resolve. It is, of course, a negotiation. But we are committed to finding constructive ways to work together for our mutual benefit. And we will work to overcome the challenges we have faced since Brexit and seize the opportunities ahead, because that is how you act in the national interest. But I would like to close by saying thank you for all of you being part of the national conversation on our relationship with Europe. Your work is vital in shaping thinking around our improved relationship with our European friends. And I'm very sorry not to be able to stay with you a lot longer this evening, but I was absolutely determined to come along to mark this event this evening. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, and let's continue this positive, constructive conversation in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much.
To see him tomorrow on the programme, he's just told me. It's always good to find out what you're doing the next day from a member of the government. So he will be with me after Prime Minister's questions, along with a representative from the Conservatives. Hello to everybody here. Lovely to see so many of you, especially coming out on such a filthy night. And I'm glad to see that we're all in the zone in the spirit of welcoming experts, because I'm about to welcome 4 of them on the stage in just a moment. As you know, it is 5 years since the UK left left the European Union after one of the most turbulent periods I've certainly ever experienced or witnessed in parliamentary politics, in British political life. And it exposed the limits of parliamentary politics to find an agreement to deliver the constitutional change that was voted on to leave in 2016. It also, Brexit, led to the downfall of David Cameron and Theresa May, two Conservative prime ministers, and delivered Boris Johnson his landslide in part in 2019. Interestingly, at the last election, last July, Brexit was very much relegated in terms of being a salient issue on the doorstep by politicians of most of the mainstream parties. So tonight, this thick document, which I'm sure you're all going to read with great interest, the Brexit files from referendum to reset, we are going to delve into the comprehensive analysis that has been looked at. We will do a little bit of the history about how we got here and where we are as a country. But let's welcome our experts onto the stage, and I'll introduce them to you. Well, as they're sitting down, Catherine Barnard from the University of Cambridge, an expert professor in the Faculty of Law, about to sit down, a familiar face to Anand Menon, who is the director here, of course, of UK and a Changing Europe. Sarah Hall, a geography professor at the University of Cambridge. And then Sir John Curtice, a familiar face on our TV screens from the University of Strathclyde and a polling expert. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to start by asking all of them, starting with you, Anand, to give a brief, around 30 seconds, I'm not going to time it, in terms of where you think we are now in the Brexit story, related to the contributions that I've read that you've put into this file.
We're at the beginning of the next stage. And it's the next stage that will go on, because as we show in the report, there is so much unfinished business that this will continue to be a central part of our national debate, even if our parties don't want to talk about it, for a long, long time to come.
Catherine?
We need politicians to make up their minds what they want, and then the lawyers will deliver it, because...
God help us.
The trouble is we've got a lawyer running the country now.
Well, that's very good news indeed. But the fact is the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, provides the framework for a future agreement. It anticipates supplementary agreements that can be slotted into the existing framework. But in the key areas of defence, foreign policy and so forth, actually the TCA doesn't touch that, so that may be a separate agreement. But lawyers will deliver whatever's necessary, and there are the structures in place to do that.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, on the economy, in the report we talk about Brexit as being a slow puncture. And I think in 30 seconds I would say it might be a slow puncture, but the UK is looking quite fervently for a repair kit currently to try and work out how that might be addressed.
And John?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, at the moment at least, it looks unlikely that the 2016 referendum will be any more successful than the 1975 one was in resolving this issue. Public opinion has not moved dramatically since 2016. But there has been a majority in favour of being inside the EU really since the 2017 general election, and certainly particularly so since the Liz Truss fiscal event. It's been running at around 57-43 now for around the last 3 years. Primarily, it has to be said, not because of people changing their minds. Most people have not changed their minds, although Leave voters are a little bit more likely to have changed their minds. But essentially, those people who did not vote in 2016, many of whom were too young to do so, are very strongly in favour of rejoining. So that's point one. Point two, yes, Joe, the politicians may not have been talking about Brexit, but Brexit still very strongly shaped who voted for whom in 2024. Indeed, amongst Remain voters, the relationship, their willingness to vote for a party that was in favour of a second referendum in 2019 as opposed to the Tories or the Brexit Party, that is largely unchanged.
Okay.
What did happen is that some Leave voters, yes, were voting for, no longer voting for pro-Leave parties, but the crucial thing that happened is that the Leave coalition fractured in the way, whereas it was very strongly united in 2019. So Brexit still matters. But it does therefore mean that we have a government that was voted by somewhere between, its vote is somewhere between 75 and 80% pro-EU, but is wanting to be very quiet about most of what Nick Thomas-Symonds was talking about this evening.
Well, let me just go to Nick Thomas-Symonds briefly, since he used a lot of phrases, words, a mature conversation, constructive collaboration, words and sentiments that I've heard an awful lot in the past few years when it comes to the issue of Brexit. Are you any more confident, before we look back, are you any more confident that there will be a deal struck in the interests of the UK in the way he has just outlined, Anand?
Not necessarily a deal. Now, I mean, what I would say is we've moved on from a time under Boris Johnson when being at loggerheads with the European Union was considered to be good politics. Okay, and at a time of global turbulence, I think that's probably a good thing. It allows us to talk and be friends and collaborate and cooperate. Signing formal deals with the European Union is a nightmare. And I think to get to that stage, there's a lot of hard work to be done. I mean, we can talk about the reset and what Keir Starmer's doing. I think we've made some mistakes already in being so slow off the block, in being quite reticent about what we're after. The thing we've got to remember in this country is when it comes to the economic relationship, we are the people who want to change it. The EU is quite happy with the status quo.
Right. I mean, Catherine, when we're talking about a deal and the framework and the sort of legal infrastructure, if you like, around the EU, there were plenty of people at the time of Brexit who said it was the EU's intransigent. It was too rules-based. Is that still the case? Is that still going to be the barrier to any sort of progress?
Well, the EU is rules-based because the EU is, frankly, a construct of law. I mean, what holds the EU together is the treaty, the two treaties, the Treaty on European Union, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, names that are not ready to set your passions alight, but that's what the EU does. It does law, and it does law very well. The problem is the law creates a rather inflexible structure, and that's when the problems arise. And so because it's very difficult to amend the treaties, the core treaties, therefore things are done around the edge. And that may be what we see happens in respect of any deal that is done between the UK and the EU, because the TCA is still quite a constrained structure. It only covers a relatively narrow range of issues. So there might be separate deals round the edge which don't fit within the framework of the TCA.
Right, I remember George Osborne, the Chancellor, and I paraphrase here, but he warned in the referendum campaign that to leave the EU would harm the British economy beyond any doubt. We'd fall off a cliff almost immediately. And that didn't happen broadly. Now, partly because we didn't leave, of course, in 2016. It took a few years to leave. And then COVID came down the line. But the OBR still maintains, the Office for Budget Responsibility, that the UK economy will be 4%, I think it's up to 4%, smaller than it would have been if we had stayed. Does that still hold water?
Yeah, I think the OBR made that prediction pretty quickly after the Brexit vote. And when you read the minutes of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, which I'm sure everyone reads with great interest, they don't see grounds to change that. I think, partly that reflects the structure of the TCA that Catherine was talking about, in that the EU met many of its strategic objectives in the sectors that it's strong in, manufacturing. The UK didn't meet many of its strategic objectives in the sector that dominates the UK economy, services. And I think it's that imbalance that underpins quite a lot of that.
But there was also the claim, certainly on the Brexit side, that calculation by the Office for Budget Responsibility was done if there weren't other mitigating effects by the UK government, trade deals that were struck. But how much has that mitigated the loss of trade to the economy?
I mean, the modelling is quite clear that the trade deals that the UK has struck since Brexit, many of which are kind of rollover agreements that the UK was essentially party to when it was an EU member state, have added relatively little to the UK economy. I think the area where there may be mitigating effects, which is quite kind of surprising given the terms of the Brexit debate, is the marked change in immigration in the UK economy. Immigration growing rapidly is generally seen as being good for the UK economy. So I don't think it's so much trade deals as immigration. And I think any kind of estimate or projection on the economic impacts of Brexit needs to come with a health warning. And you've seen this in the debate about these figures, because you're trying to untangle the impacts of Brexit from the impacts of COVID, from the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc., etc. So it's only going to get harder, I think, as we
But
go
the problem,
forward.
surely, Sarah, with that immigration, is immigration may increase the size of the economy, but it doesn't necessarily increase GDP per head. And one of the fundamental problems, one of the reasons why government ministers now constantly about growth, they're not just wanting to grow the size of the economy, they are actually wanting to increase GDP per head. And that is rather more of a challenge.
Well,
and
on that,
immigration
yeah,
doesn't
but
necessarily facilitate
yes, but on
that.
that immigration question then, if we assume that a large percentage of people who voted to leave the EU did so in part because they wanted to see lower levels of immigration, what we've seen since we've left the EU, and certainly under the Conservatives, is record levels of immigration. What has that done to people's minds when it comes to whether they think Brexit has delivered or not?
The short answer to you is that, quite remarkably, those who voted leave are more likely to believe that as a result of Brexit, immigration is higher than it otherwise would be, than is the case amongst Remain voters. So Leave voters are particularly of the view that Brexit has failed to cut immigration. They now are inclined to take, many of them, to take the view that it's increased. However, that perception, for the most part, is not correlated with Leave voters changing their minds about Brexit. They take it as an unfortunate fact of life, which they would regard as a failure to implement Brexit properly rather than necessarily a failure of principle. The thing that undermines Brexit, the willingness of Leave voters to continue to support Brexit, is they've come to the conclusion that it's been economically disadvantageous. That's the thing that helps to push them, potentially some of them, away from supporting Brexit. On the other hand, the one thing that most Leave, and now, economic pessimism is, it's not as widespread as it is amongst Remain voters, but it's fairly widespread. The one thing that Leave voters are still inclined to believe in is to believe that as a result of Brexit, we have more control over our own affairs. And for them, of course, control has always been a key issue.
Well, this issue of sovereignty, it means, I suppose, different things to different people. But the idea, as some politicians said, that once we leave the EU, we can no longer blame the EU for problems here. But, Catherine, we are still very entwined with the EU in terms of some of the things Boris Johnson said, that we would have a bonfire of regulations, we would pull out of all of the EU laws. But that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened. And if you look at the so-called retained EU law dashboard, it's stuck at about 4,000 bits of EU law are still on our statute books. Now, you might recall the retained EU law bill, the original objective was to turn all of that legislation off, keep bits and pieces, but turn it all off. And then there was, in my view, sensibly a change of heart about that. But what you see is that although the UK government thought that there were about 3,000 pieces of EU law on the UK statute book, when they started looking a bit more closely, they discovered it went up to about 6,500. It's gone down from 6,500 to about 4,000 and a bit. And under Rishi Sunak and now under Keir Starmer, that figure has remained pretty static. Now, that brings us to the next question about dynamic alignment. Now, this terminology is pretty rebarbative, but what that means is that will the UK consciously decide to keep up to speed with EU rules? Now, so far, we have not done that. And so while we're not seeing a lot of de-alignment, i.e. turning off EU rules, the fact is that over the last couple of years, the EU has legislated like topsy. And so what you're seeing is a sort of passive de-alignment that we have not kept pace with those EU rules. And so you've now got comprehensive EU rules in respect of digital services, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, huge quantities of legislation in respect of the environment. Now, there's a piece of legislation going through Parliament at the moment, which goes by the most mundane of names, not to excite concern, which is the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill.
Goodness.
In that bill, it gives the UK the power, for the first time for the UK as a whole, to voluntarily align with EU rules in respect of things to do with the environment. And so what we're seeing now, going back to your question about what's happened to all these rules, we're keeping on board all of those 4,000 rules, plus we will actively give ourselves the powers to align. And of course, in respect of Northern Ireland, we have to carry on aligning in respect of all the rules that still apply there.
Right. These are questions for which I might need my glass. Oh, thank you so much. I might need my glasses.
Sorry.
Just before I come to questions, and thank you for putting them through. Anand, can I go back then to the turbulent period I mentioned, obviously, when everyone was fighting in Parliament over what sort of Brexit there should be, and there was the description of a softer Brexit. And there are many politicians, mostly Labour, who have said to me in the subsequent years that if I'd known then what I know now, I would have signed up to Theresa May's so-called softer Brexit. Why didn't it happen? Was it a spectacular failure of statecraft?
Oh, there were a number of spectacular failures of statecraft going on then. I mean, firstly, I should say that in UK and a changing Europe, those years are known as the golden years.
Yes, they were
Not
good for
everyone,
our
but yeah,
business too,
exactly.
but anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
very good business.
Aside, yeah.
I mean, let's go through it. I mean, Theresa May is a really interesting case study of learning from painful reality. From where she started off to where she ended, there was a massive gulf. So as she learnt what Brexit meant, she softened her position. I should say in parentheses that actually the deal that Theresa May negotiated was a spectacularly good one. I mean, far better, I think, than most people who understand the European Union thought they'd be willing to give. But the backstop provided a really privileged position for the UK. But on your question about Labour, I just think that's nonsense. I think Labour knew what they were doing and they weren't going to vote for the deal because it was a Tory deal. I mean, Theresa May's deal ticked every single box of what Corbyn wanted from Brexit. But it was a Tory deal, and the Labour Party thought if we vote this down, it gives us political advantage. And I think that was the issue. I mean, we hear all this stuff about how Brexit overrode party politics. In that crucial series of votes in 2019, I really don't think it did.
Right, well then, again, to refer back to what Nick Thomas-Symonds said, that, you know, the status quo can't stay, we've got to improve the deal. There's a question here from Maria. What will it take to push a British government to be bold about Brexit, start talking about a new referendum, or going back to the customs union? These are These are red lines, but on the basis of what you have written on the economy, why not? If they want growth, will it give them the growth and the economic progress they want? If they just said, we'll join a customs union, even if it is on goods and not on services, would that do it?
So I think, you know, the data isn't totally clear on precisely what value you would get. It would be better in terms of trade than where we are now. I think the big question is that the politics of that are very, very difficult for the Labour government. They've just come into power after a number of years outside of power, okay with a huge majority, but are they prepared, or do they want to use up political capital trying to push through something that could open up something that remains, I think, something of a bit of an open wound in British political life? And I think that's where the challenge lies.
Right.
Also, Joe, I'm not sure it's necessarily a good look for a British government to come in and do something it's explicitly ruled out in its manifesto.
Well, some people might say it's done a few of those things.
Well, no, sure.
But I mean, I just put that out there. I mean, how difficult would that be politically, John? Because when you look at a lot of the new intake of Labour MPs, a lot of them will remain. They would privately want to see a much closer relationship that is actually rejoining or joining a customs union. How difficult would it be politically to go there if they can justify it on the basis of, we'll get great growth?
Well, in general in politics, it's a bad idea to sell out on a unique selling proposition. That was a lesson that Nick Clegg painfully learnt over tuition fees in 2010 to 2011. And that's still risky, even if you might be switching a position which you're more in favour. I mean, that said, Labour, in a sense, do potentially have a political problem in that they made a decision in 2020 that they needed to go basically to back Brexit in the belief that that was essential to their ability to regain the support of former Labour voters who voted Leave, and unless they succeeded in doing that, they wouldn't manage to win a majority at the next election. Well, they did win a majority at the next election, but they did so largely without particularly being successful at reconnecting with Leave voters, and certainly not reconnecting particularly with working class voters at all. But as so much has been true of this government, some of the most crucial decisions have been made long before actually getting into power. What I would then say is that, however, one of the reasons why the Labour Party have been able until now to adopt the position that they have done is that at least south of the border, i.e. south of the Anglo-Scottish border, that there hasn't been anybody who has been particularly advocating reversing the decision. North of the border, the SNP have never stopped saying that Brexit was a mistake. And as a result, you can see very clearly that the Labour Party is less successful at picking up the support of Remain voters than they are south of the border. But the party that might now be beginning to change its position, or at least not its position, but its advocacy, is the Liberal Democrats, and that cover that basically Labour's position on Brexit has not been attacked from, as it were, the pro-European end of the spectrum. That cover may now be beginning to wear thin. We have to see where it goes. But one of the fundamental problems facing the Liberal Democrats is that they have maxed out the so-called blue wall strategy. They've got virtually all of the seats already that they are in competition with the Conservatives, but they are in a very, very weak position so far as being able to profit from the weakness of a Labour government. So they've got to think about how they can find a flank to attack Labour, which they largely weren't doing for the last 5 years, and Brexit is potentially one potential opportunity they might want to seize.
Catherine, what about the EU? I mean, do they want us in any sort of real, tangible shape, sense or form? I know we've heard about this pan-European scheme that Maros Sefcovic talked about, but what would the trade-offs have to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. For someone like me who's been teaching customs union forever, suddenly to see it on the front pages is absolutely remarkable, because...
If you wait long enough,
yeah, eventually. Now, so the problem about joining the customs union, which is legally possible, is it puts us in a position like Turkey. And Turkey's in the EU customs union, but it's in an unfavourable position because in respect of, for example, goods coming in from Canada, Turkey has to take all of the Canadian goods, but has no access to the Canadian market the other way around. So it's not actually an ideal place. So even if you start thinking about what the customs union look like were the UK to join, the answer is actually, when we look at it closely, we might not like what we see. So what's been proposed instead is PEM, the Pan European Mediterranean Convention, which has got 25 states in it, including the EU, which thus includes the 27. And it is a remarkable thing because it expands from Jordan and Syria to Morocco. And basically, it slightly makes rules of origin easier in supply chains. But it's not going to have the transformative effect that people might hope. It will make things easier for certain sectors, the car industry being a good example.
I mean, one of the questions here, Mike Cashman, is along those lines, the significance of this pan-European Mediterranean Convention that is being considered. What do you think is the significance politically, and the youth mobility scheme that has also been talked about? And there certainly are people within the government themselves, privately, who say they don't know why it's not being considered.
Okay, on the pan-European thing, the economics, the significance is trivial. Right. Absolutely trivial. Politically, it's more significant because it can be seen as a first step. That is to say, the government showing willing to remove even some limited frictions could be seen as a first step. On youth mobility, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because there's a weirdness about the debate about youth mobility. Firstly, that the EU are so hung up on it. I mean, the German ambassador in London can't step outside his door without mentioning youth mobility at the moment. And I don't quite understand why it's become so central, but it has become a test of faith for us. On our side, there are several things. I mean, there's a traditional thing, which is the Home Office doesn't like foreigners coming here, as far as we can tell. And basically anything that jacks up the numbers, the Home Office opposes. But there seems to be also the Labour Party has talked itself into a situation where this is harder than it should be. Because every time a youth mobility deal is mentioned, you have a minister standing up and rather robotically saying, we are not going back to freedom of movement. This isn't freedom of movement because it involves visas. But they've made that link, and I think it makes it harder to make compromises.
Do you think it is seen, or will be seen, as freedom of movement, John?
Well, that gets us to a slightly broader point, which is one of the things I think the government has to think about is if it does succeed in negotiating some elements, at least, with success, some of the elements of what it is wanting to achieve with the European Union, is how it's going to succeed in selling that politically. Because at some point, it's going to have to advocate and defend what it's done. And one of the things that emerges very clearly is, so if we just take, for example, the example of youth mobility. If you frame a survey question that says, should British young people have the right to go to the European Union and European Union citizens have the right to come here, you'll get a lot of people saying yes. If, on the other hand, you say, well, should young people have the automatic right to a visa to come here, and then the same thing with British students, you get much lower levels of support. In other words, the framing of the issue is crucial to how the public reacts to it, not least, of course, because they've not, for the most part, heard about what this is about. So therefore, how you ask the survey question makes a big difference. So I think, therefore, one of the things Labour will have to think about in the longer run is, even if they want to go sotto voce at the moment, at some point they will need to start advocating what they've done, because if they don't frame the debate to their advantage, their opponents will attempt to frame it to their advantage. And in particular, I think one of the ironies about, as it were, the fact that we are now talking about, well, maybe we might have a veterinary agreement in return for so-called youth mobility scheme, is that the trade-offs are very, very explicit, and the potential downsides are made very, very explicit. And ironically, I think in some ways, selling detailed trade-offs could prove politically more difficult than, for example, the whole package thing about, well, should we or should not be rejoining the single market, because the costs are absolutely clear and upfront.
Right. I mean, in terms of the economics, Sarah, what about the EU, the state of the Eurozone, and the state of the European Union as a whole? Because there are lots of Brexit-supporting politicians who say, why would we want to be part of the EU and the Eurozone? They're not doing very well economically either when you look at the state of Germany and France. What's the truth to that?
I mean, it's undoubtedly clear that if you look at a European economy like Germany, it's really struggling at the moment. And there are reasons for that that extend far beyond Brexit, particularly around export markets, the collapse in export markets internationally, and the challenge around energy pricing and energy security. That being said, the research on trade is very clear that geography matters, and countries usually trade most with their nearest geographical partners. Now, more recently, there's been interesting research about whether we're seeing the rise of kind of friendshoring or like ally trading, whereby because of kind of growing geopolitical tensions, countries increasingly look to trade with nations that they are geopolitically aligned with. And you could interpret that Australia and New Zealand trade deals as part of that, drawing on a sort of Commonwealth history. But if you think friendshoring, so trading with a country that you get on with, and a set of countries that you're close to matter, and the research shows it is, then the EU is an obvious trading partner for the UK and remains so, despite the economic challenges that it does face. I think as well, the other critical point here is that the global economy that the UK now finds itself navigating is markedly different to the global economy at the point of Brexit. And there's in some ways we're trying to navigate new trading relationships when international trade isn't really in fashion and trade is becoming increasingly protectionist in nature.
I mean, one of the things that successive Conservative governments said is we haven't seen the success, or we haven't made the most of the benefits of Brexit. And one of the models that was certainly a version of Brexit from a particular part of the Conservative Party was to become like Singapore on Thames, go full blast for deregulation, cut taxes, well, I suppose a bit of the sense of the spirit of the Liz Truss. would that have made a success of Brexit? Now, politically, I presume it wouldn't have been palatable, but would it economically have made a success of Brexit?
That's like $1 million question. I think what's most interesting is how, and my colleague Joël Reland has written about this, how this narrative of kind of big deregulation seems to be back on the table, which is, I find that almost the most interesting thing in the news in the past couple of weeks, that, you know, as the government searches for growth aggressively, you know, the sort of lever that seems to be pulled most strongly is a kind of bonfire of regulation, including heads of regulatory agencies. So I think the spectre of Singapore and Thames maybe is kind of resurging again, and there seems to be a real sense that, you know, can you deliver economic growth through massive regulatory change?
Anand?
I mean, we have a funny old debate about regulation in this country, because regulation sometimes is crucial to growth if you think about things like competition law. So the political debate about regulation is ridiculously oversimplistic, it seems to me. But the politics of Brexit here is really fascinating, because you're absolutely right. The inspiration for Brexit, if you go back to the old Eurosceptics, was a bunch of conservatives who, you remember the debates in the old days, it was about the working time directive, it was about over-regulation. Yep. If we leave, we can have a bonfire of the regulations and free ourselves. But the paradox about Brexit was, to get Brexit, those conservatives had to make an alliance with people who quite like regulation. Yep. So you end up with, the only way you get Brexit is by teaming up with a bunch of people who don't want what you expect Brexit to deliver. And that was the kind of mess the Conservatives ended up in, which was they had an agenda, but the Brexit coalition would not let them pursue it.
Yeah, because take back control meant we want protection.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Working Time Directive, which was always seen as the sort of number one up against the wall, it's still absolutely there. It hasn't been tampered with at all. And even if you didn't think that we could get rid of the whole thing, there are bits of the working time regulations and case law of the Court of Justice which have caused real problems, and we could remove, and we've scarcely touched that. There was a tiny tinkering at the time when Camille Badenoch announced that they were going to reverse their decision on the bonfire of regulation, but basically it's all still there. And if you look now at the Employment Rights Bill that's going through Parliament, I mean, it's one of the most complex pieces of legislation. And if you, I don't know if anyone in this room has actually looked at it. I'm sure Anand has.
I have actually. Cheeky.
From afar. It's so fiendishly complicated. I mean, it's a tribute to the parliamentary draftsman, but it's a fiendishly complicated. It will cause huge issues for employers going forward, a lot of rights for employees. And so it feeds into that very debate you've been talking about, that actually a lot of people who voted Brexit want to have a protective arm put around them.
Right. I mean, in terms of then when you're looking at moving forward in the way that Sarah's described, deregulation is very much back on the table. But I remember asking endless politicians, tell me which regulations you want to cut. And they might have been able to find one or two. But they couldn't really point to a whole raft of regulations that could be cut. But surely you can deregulate, can't you? Without harming, to some extent, the base of your economy.
I mean, I think maybe the bigger issue on regulation that the UK needs to think through, and I think Catherine alluded to this, is that you don't regulate in a vacuum. So in many ways, regulation is a set of relative values. How relatively strongly regulated are you on pension funds, say, compared to France? And so I think that's the big question for the UK. Does it feel like it's over-regulated compared to its competitors? That's the first sort of relative point. And the second point is this big question about to what degree is the UK prepared to align with the EU on key regulations in order to secure lower costs for businesses and therefore hope to grow trade. So I think maybe it'll be interesting to see how this regulatory debate plays out, but maybe it's more about regulatory relations rather than it is some sort of race to the bottom.
That's the rub, isn't it? In that, a lot of people say fintech, AI, all those sorts of areas. The EU is hamstrung by the precautionary principle. They over-regulate. We can do things differently. We can be more liberal. But the thing you run into at the end of that is, we have to sell the stuff we make somewhere afterwards. And if our regulations aren't acceptable to the European Union, we lose access to that market. So squaring that circle is incredibly difficult.
And some of the deregulation agenda is, in a sense, trying to seize what might be thought to be rather short-term opportunities. So, I mean, just take two examples. One is that we are now wanting to loosen the rules on people being able to get a mortgage. We seem to be wanting to forget the lesson of the financial crash. And secondly, for those of us working in a sector where arguments about pensions has caused a lot of labour market relations, all of a sudden we are now saying, well, gosh, our pension funds with defined benefit schemes are in surplus. So we now need to use the money. Well, hang on, this money is very, very recent. It's presumably, ironically, at least in part, the result of the fact that interest rates is going up, which is something the government was desperate not to happen. This is, I mean, you can see the way in which politicians are seemingly grasping short-term opportunities and perhaps not necessarily thinking of what the long-term economic history behind some of this actually is.
Yeah.
Can I go back to something that Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, said to us yesterday on the programme, which is that there is now a clear and sustained majority, you said that there always have been, to rejoin the EU, straightforwardly rejoin, and that there is no reason now for us not to start campaigning for another referendum, or certainly fairly soon for another referendum to reverse that decision. I mean, what sort of groundswell would there need to be? You've talked about the Liberal Democrats, but what sort of groundswell would there have to be to even contemplate?
Well, no, that's not the way it works, Joe, right?
That told me. Or Lord Heseltine.
It will happen if and when a government finds itself in a situation where it's the best way out of whatever political electoral hole it's currently in. So why did we have a referendum in 2016? Because David Cameron thought of the way he's getting out of the hole with Brexit. Given we are perhaps entering an era of multi-party politics, we have to think about what happens in home parliaments. If by let's say 2029, Liberal Democrats are very clear that we should be trying to reverse the process, and Labour are trying to think about how they get back, how they retain power, we may have a bargain in which the part of the deal is, Liberal Democrats have got form on insisting on referendums as part of deals for a government. So the point is, it's a realpolitik. Now, if you do believe in rejoin, of course, there is nothing to stop you from campaigning now. And in a sense, I mean, there are two ways, frankly, of looking at where we are. One way of looking at it is to say, well, actually, it's pretty remarkable that public opinion has moved as much as it has done, given that at least in England, nobody's been advocating a change of position. On the other hand, what is also actually clear, and this is clear in some of the British social attitudes data, is that while, yes, we have a majority of us who are in favour of rejoin, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that a majority of us are signed up to the project of an ever closer union. And that some of the people who would vote to rejoin quite happily would like the European Union to be less powerful rather than more powerful. And of course, one of the things that's happened while we've been out is that in some respects, the European Union is now a more powerful institution. And so to that extent, at least at the end of the day, what would happen? Well, what would happen depend on the success or other of the arguments that are marshalled on both sides. For my money, the fundamental failure of those on the Remain side last time is they failed to advocate a vision as to why being inside the European Union would be a good thing, as opposed to trying to simply say that leaving would be a bad thing. So yes, if you believe in reversing Brexit, the time to think about how you frame the arguments and to do the campaigning is undoubtedly now. At the same time, of course, you're going to be wanting to campaign inside political parties.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. I have had a couple of them here, which I've asked. But yes, Anand and Catherine, maybe final...
I was going to say is you need to think about the other side of the table and whether or not the European Union would even countenance negotiations if our main opposition party, the Conservatives, assuming they are, were committed to pulling us out again as soon as we rejoined. I think the EU would want a settled opinion, both politically and with public opinion, before they sat down with us for that talk.
I think the other thing we should just think about is that the EU is not the place it was in 2016 or 2020, and the EU itself is going through a period of considerable uncertainty. I don't think it's the self-confident body it was in 2016, 2017. I think it is, I mean, obviously we know the politics is complex. We know situation in the big countries is difficult. Germany, elections shortly. France, elections in 27. And also if you just look at, going back to what we were saying about deregulation, if we looked at the front page of the FT yesterday, the lead story was that the huge pressure on the EU to get rid of some of this regulation, which they say which is said to be hindering their growth. Their growth is pretty desultory too.
Right, just before I do throw it out to the audience here, someone has asked about, does the report identify any clear benefits from Brexit?
I mean, yes, in the sense, I mean, Brexit was always about trade-offs, and if you believe that actually what you wanted was a country that decided on its own immigration policy, that is what we've got. I mean, one of the paradoxes about this is, of course, that the Conservative government had an immigration policy and then started saying, where are all these immigrants coming from?
But they decided to do that.
And indeed, if you believe in the value and the merits of a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, the way in which immigration policy was changed in the post-Brexit environment made that more possible. So we now have more migration than we did before, and it is more culturally and ethnically diverse than it was before. So for those of you who believe in diversity, you should rejoice at this benefit that Brexit has given the country.
More Indians.
Sarah?
You know, I mean, on the economics, I think the immigration story is the one that surprised us.
Said, yes, at the beginning. And all right, well, let me go out now to you guys. A couple of house rules. Keep the questions short. No speeches, if possible. I'll leave that for the guests to do that. The panel can do speeches. And I think there are roving microphones. So please do put your hand up and say, right, well, where are the microphones? That's what I need to... there's one. Well, the gentleman just in front of you. And then I'll come over here in just a moment. Yep. This.
Good evening. Is it working?
Yes.
It's working. Catherine's right. Political paralysis is the problem. The lawyers would spin with this invisible thread to make it work. You are also right, John, insofar as Labour didn't profit from the Red Wall. My question is about Labour. I talk to Labour MPs all the time and MEPs. They tell me, shh, don't tell them. In 2032 we'll rejoin under the table. I tell them, no, because the damage will be complete by that time. Much of it will be irreversible, like a chemical reaction. And if you can't get people out to do anything now, what chance have you got in 2032? And they go, yeah, you're right. Any comments?
John?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious why the Labour Party, I think we've probably already said some of this before, it's pretty obvious why the Labour Party doesn't want to deal with it now, whatever its preferences privately might be. It's spent 14 years out of power. Getting involved in a referendum will use up a lot of political capital, is potentially very risky. And they've got a mission, to deliver growth. And I don't think they want, therefore, to be diverted from the path on which they're currently embarked, albeit they're finding that that path is much stonier and has many more obstacles than perhaps they realised 6 months ago.
Anand?
No, I agree with that. I mean, and actually one of the reasons why if you were the Labour government you wouldn't be thinking in these terms is whatever you do with the European Union, you're not going to get that sort of growth that you need by the next election, and they need it by the next election.
The gentleman there, yes, with his hand up right in front of me. Yep.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Chris Morris. I'm the Chief Executive of
yes.
Full Fact. And
I recognise you now.
You're in the dark.
Full disclosure, Anand is one of our trustees, although he barely turned
You're amongst friends, do confide.
We mute that mic now.
So my question is, you're all being quite polite. So I wonder if you could tell us what you really think. How good or bad a position do you think we are in 5 years on? And that could be politically, economically, or legally, however you choose to interpret that.
All right.
Given where we were, given what you know of where we were 5 years ago.
Sarah, tell us what you really think.
So I don't think the cliff edge worst case scenario of Brexit materialised economically. But I do think the UK economy has some real challenges related to Brexit, but they actually go far beyond that. I think, though, for me, the when I think about the medium to longer term, there are some elements where I see grounds for optimism. So the UK has a highly educated labour market. It still attracts quite significant degrees of highly skilled workers. The legal system, respect to Catherine, is widely respected, particularly in kind of heavily regulated sectors. Regulators currently still do stand in quite high esteem internationally. So I think it's actually quite helpful to take a much longer view. I mean, my own research is on financial services, where worst case scenarios definitely didn't happen, but the sector is flatlining, and I think it's trying to tease out those kind of short-term challenges versus kind of possibly a more optimistic longer-term scenario.
So, Catherine, when it comes to lawyers, the legal system, and some of those headlines that you'll remember during those Brexit years when the government didn't exactly come out and defend judges, what do you think? Tell us what you really think about the change 5 years on.
So, as the report shows, Brexit was delivered by law. It required a large number of pieces of legislation which have really reshaped the constitutional landscape. And it must be said, the most important of those laws is the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which is actually quite a remarkable piece of legislation. The fact that there hasn't been a huge amount of litigation over it suggests that it actually has delivered, and its delivery was in terms of continuity. You still need to know lots about EU law, very important for professors of EU law to advocate that. You still need to know lots of EU law because there's 4,000 or so bits of EU law in the statute book. And indeed, all of the pre-Brexit case law still applies in the UK, although the highest courts can depart from it. And what's interesting is that the courts have shown very little appetite for departing from it, which is one of the reasons why in the retained EU law bill and now it's got slightly changed in the final version, there was a sort of big kick by the government to tell the judges to be a bit more enthusiastic about Brexit. But remember, judges are conservative, probably with a large, but certainly with a small c, and judges don't really want to make radical handbrake turns, and therefore they have kept a sort of pattern of steady as you go. So the law has probably responded well. The area where you do see, and this goes back to the root of your question, you'll remember the Gina Miller case, the first Gina Miller case where Gina Miller asked, essentially, does Theresa May have the executive powers, the prerogative powers to use the jargon, to trigger Article 50? And Gina Miller challenged that, and it went all the way through the system, but the Supreme Court said, no, she didn't have powers, there needed to be an act of Parliament. Well, at first instance, you'll remember, the Daily Mail had that absolutely appalling headline, Enemies of the People, which was, of course, legally wrong, because they were not being asked to rule on the rights or wrongs of Brexit, but on the much narrower question about whether you need an act of Parliament. Secondly, it did huge damage to the judiciary, and Anand disagrees because he thinks the judges shouldn't be held in such high regard, but it also showed the tremendous failure by the then Secretary of State for Justice, Liz Truss, who it seems was somewhere in Norfolk, I think, and not paying attention to a constitutional role, which was to defend the judges. The personal attacks on the judges were really very serious indeed. You might recall one was described as a gay ex-Olympic fencer or ex-gay Olympic fencer. I'm not quite sure which order the adjectives went in.
Ex-fencer, not ex-gay.
Yeah, I think it was probably but ex-Olympic as well.
Thanks for clearing that up.
But the bottom line was that these personal attacks the personal attacks on judiciary for doing their job is not acceptable, and Liz Truss should have stepped in.
Is there anything that you haven't said that you'd like to confess in the way Chris phrased that question?
I mean, what I would say, all right, we're poorer because of Brexit. Brexit was never going to be a catastrophe economically, and it hasn't been, but we're poorer. But I think Brexit has contributed to a reshaping of politics that in many ways is very, very healthy. One of the things, if you look at our politics now, it's far harder to take voters for granted than it was. There are far fewer safe seats than there were. We've noticed parts of the country that we didn't notice pre-2016 because they actually turned out and voted no. the nature of our politics has changed quite profoundly. It doesn't mean for the better, because that requires politicians to act on this. But I think actually Brexit contributed to some quite positive developments, I think, in politics.
Can I just follow up on the legal side, because of that difficult period from your point of view on behalf of the sort of legal profession? What did you make, though, of the attacks that you were blocking the right of the democratic right of the people, that the law was getting in the way, that you were being too active in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Gina Miller case, particularly the second one about the prorogation of Parliament, was probably the most controversial. I think there was quite a lot of surprise that the Supreme Court went as far as it did. And I think what we've seen since then, since the Baroness Hale presidency of the Supreme Court, is a significant rowing back. You see it in a number of ways. You see the Supreme Court, depending on your point of view, being more conservative, more cautious, and not coming out with big, noteworthy judgments. But you also see a rowing back by the lower courts, much less willing to find against the government in judicial reviews. Now, a lot of people would say that's a good thing, because it's putting the courts back in their box, and that they should not be there at the front line of these ultimately political battles. And then this is where it becomes interesting, both legally and academically. You know, where does law stop in these highly vexed political instances? And that's essentially what the Gina Miller 2 case was about. To what extent should the law intervene in what was ultimately a political decision to prorogue for 5 weeks?
Yeah.
Now, we know that the Supreme Court unanimously said this is actually a legal issue, because it's about the accountability of the executive to Parliament. But there is a strong case to be made, and a lot of my more politically active colleagues who are Brexiteers would make that case to say that's not absolutely at all where the court should be.
Next question. Yes, the lady here.
Thank you. Olivia O'Sullivan from the Chatham House UK in the World programme. It struck me that Nick Thomas Simon, when he was here, the main shift that he referenced was the geopolitical shift in terms of opening up prospects for a different relationship with the EU. And I'm curious what the panel thinks about the prospects for that. Initially, the Theresa May Brexit deal had a degree of foreign policy and security cooperation in it, and then we lost that in the final reckoning, the final TCA. What do you think might be coming down the track in terms of security and foreign policy cooperation with the UK and the EU, and where do you think there might be benefits for the UK in that? Thank you.
Who would like to pick up on that first?
Me, I suppose.
Well, don't sound so eager, but
No,
yes,
I mean,
go for it.
I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit about coordination, cooperation, maybe exchanges between foreign policy staff and things like that. And I think both sides are quite keen on that. There are two difficulties that I identify. The first is what the UK is very keen on is access to some of the spending programmes the EU has launched in the area of defence procurement. And that's something that to date the EU has resisted. But things like the European Defence Fund, the European, I can't remember what it's called, they've launched a new armaments initiative. But I think that will be a difficult negotiation. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. A lot of people just assume that because of Trump it drives the UK and the EU closer together. I think there's a real danger it drives us further apart, and that Trump imposes some fairly nasty choices on us. I mean, if Donald Trump were to say, okay, we have a very privileged security relationship, you do it with us, we don't want to see you doing it with them, that creates some problems for us. So I do worry that Trump will drive us apart, and that actually some of the difficult negotiations over the political economy of defence and security, it's going to be quite hard for us to get what we want. And not just what we want, but what I think Europe needs. I think Europe is stronger if the UK is part of those initiatives, but the rules of the EU at the moment keep us out.
Just to pick up on that, on defence, on Olivia, is it the question of the arrival of Trump,
Yeah.
and whether there is a choice that has to be made between the UK tilting one way or the other towards the EU or towards the US, and perhaps we can do a little bit on the economic model. But in terms of defence, he wants us to spend far more. He wants the EU to spend far, far more. Surely in that sense, we're sort of being pushed towards the EU, NATO, of course, in terms of increasing spending, defence spending.
I mean, to an extent, I think the noises from the government at the moment is that we're not going to increase defence spending in the near term. And I think one of the points worth making here is this isn't new. I mean, if anyone who looked at the United States from before the first Trump administration could see that the long-term trend was that the United States would spend less time worrying about Europe, less money spent on Europe. And we've known this for a while and done very little about it. So I fail to see why it will automatically lead to results this time around. We've seen some really striking outcomes in Europe since the war in Ukraine, like Polish defence spending has gone up astronomically. Yeah. But
unsurprisingly, I suppose, to that extent. What about economically?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the recent news has shown that Trump is very willing to use trade as a tool in diplomacy. And that potentially does cause some issues for the UK. Firstly, I'd say I don't think you really know what's coming down the tracks from Trump until it actually arrives. So I would be a little bit cautious around the bluster. But it does seem, quite clear that he's very willing to try and meet some of his objectives by imposing some pretty stringent trade choices on third countries. Right. I think we've already seen some of that mood music, and I think an important point here is that the UK's trade profile with the US is quite different to that with the EU. So the UK relies on the US for exports in services, relatively speaking, whereas with the EU, the picture is much more in manufacturing. And you've already seen the government kind of saying, it's actually services that we trade with you. So if you come down heavy on EU manufacturing, just bear in mind that, that's a slightly different picture for the UK.
But the sight of a US-UK trade deal is not on the horizon, is it?
I don't think that's likely.
Another question. Yes, if the mics can come perhaps to the front. We have two questions here.
You go first.
Very polite.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Yeah, okay. Good evening. My name is Aurore Charon. I'm a trainee journalist at City News. You've talked about the youth mobility scheme before. I guess our question would be in terms of, adding more and strengthening the relationship between the UK and the EU. Could this be a good opportunity for young people to add more economic growth and cultural exchanges?
Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, the scheme that the Commission proposed back in May was an extraordinarily broad and ambitious scheme, and the most difficult bit for the UK probably would have been the fact that EU students would pay domestic fees, which are not cheap at 9,200, but a whole lot cheaper than the 40 or 50,000 they're having to pay now post-Brexit. And yes, actually, the government does get, or governments get, the fact that young people are good for the economy, because there's anyone who's graduated from British University can stay for 2 years under the graduate visa scheme, and they can work for whatever employer they like. So there is absolutely a case to be made. The problem is that there is this wholly incorrect link between the youth mobility scheme and free movement. And it's not free movement because there's no right to stay beyond the short period. There is no right to bring your family members. There will be no right to claim social benefits. So it is completely different to free movement. But unfortunately, that link has been made. Now, I think down the line there will be some sort of deal on it, but it will be called something else. It won't be called a youth mobility scheme. It will be called a cultural exchange scheme or a youth experience scheme. There'll be some redressing of what there is, and it will be much less ambitious than what the Commission proposed. It's not at all clear why the Commission did what it did back in May, because of course it triggered apoplexy amongst the Tories, and of course therefore it had to trigger apoplexy amongst Labour. Yes, they were worried about the fact that the UK was trying to do bilateral deals with Madrid and Paris, but that doesn't really explain why the Commission went in with a full fat proposal in May just as the election was coming up.
The gentleman here. This lady's coming round with the mic. You've got two to choose from.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the difficulty for the UK and the EU is not going to be so much on the pressure that Donald Trump puts on us in working together. And I think that politicians stay sensible rather than what some of the EU ones have done in telling Trump to F off, that things for the UK should be pretty reasonable. However, what I see the difficulty is for the EU in the coming years, it's going to find things extremely difficult for it to operate in the way that it's operated before in getting countries to do things and agree things, in that it's always done it through paying them to do things, basically. And you've got Italy that's gone over to Donald Trump and meeting him, because Italy wants a lot of money from the EU. The EU is going to find it incredibly difficult to get hold of money in order to sort of go along in paying people to do things and follow.
So
and it's going to put a lot of money in defence. Therefore, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for the UK to be, or the EU to make agreements internally that allows the UK to actually come with agreements with the EU.
Okay,
Given the EU's going that way, how's that going to affect the UK in doing anything with the EU?
Do you think there is, truth in the fact that if they're having enough problems internally on agreeing that will make it more difficult with the UK?
I mean, to an extent, it's always worth pinching yourself if you're a Brit and reminding yourself that we are not a priority for the European Union. I mean, however much we think we should be, we're not. Partly because, as you say, they've got enough other problems to be dealing with without worrying about us. And yes, there are divisions in the European Union, but one of the interesting things about the European Union at the moment, I think, is that there are a lot of populist parties doing quite well in national elections. And those populist parties, even though they're not saying we should leave the European Union, they're saying the European Union should be a lot weaker, the Commission shouldn't be telling us what to do. And in a way, that shapes the EU's attitude towards us, because the EU don't want us flourishing economically on the outside, because that gives grist to the mill of the populists. If Britain does really well, populists on the continent can say, you see, they're doing absolutely fine, we could do with less European Union. So they have an incentive not to do us favours when it comes to the economic relationship. And I think that's always going to be important in limiting what they will give us in a negotiation.
Another question. Yes, there's a gentleman here. The glasses.
Hello, I am Geevke, a European movement, so it's going to be a leading question. Doesn't the panel think that the government objectives that the minister set out are contradictory what would basically conflict with the red lines it set out for itself as well?
Nick Thomas Simmons, you mean, in terms of what he's trying to achieve, that he would have to break his red lines?
Yeah, and able to deliver on his objectives, perhaps apart from security, basically are in direct conflict with the red lines it set out for themselves.
John?
Well, if you're saying that there is potentially a tension between the pursuit of growth and staying outside the single market, well, Sarah will tell you, yeah, sure, there is a tension there, but they won't be the first politicians to try to believe two inconceivable things at once. That's the nature of the beast. I guess my gentle advice to those of you who want to see things change is probably not to carp at what you perceive as the inconsistency of the Labour Party, or what you might regard as this lack of spine, but rather to work towards creating the political conditions under which the Labour Party might find it easier, in its interest, to move in a more pro-European direction than it's willing to do so at the moment. I think that's it's easy to play the carping game, but the truth is, at the end of the day, although I will say to you, there's clearly a majority in favour of rejoin rather than stay out, I am not sure how far that is necessarily sufficiently solid to withstand what might still be a very effective stay-out campaign. And that the job that you and the European movement and others who think like you have is to change the public mood in this country so that actually the politicians decide that this is the direction in which they need to go. I think so forget the carping and get on with the campaigning.
Anyone else want to respond on that? No? Another question? Yes. One of the two people with their hands up there. You choose.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Pravar Patkar, International Centre for Sustainability. Question around how has Brexit affected Westminster's relationships with the devolved institutions, and what impact might that have on a closer relationship going forward and potentially rejoining?
John?
Yeah, okay. There is an excellent chapter in the article by...
Which page?
on Brexit and devolution. And of course, you know, one of the ironies of the whole Brexit debate has been that those on the Brexit side of the argument, who have been very keen to dismantle the EU single market, were also very, very keen to maintain the integrity of the EU single market. And certainly, the chapter in this book largely articulates this view. There is a feeling that the Single Market Act has significantly reduced the freedom of manoeuvre of the devolved administrations to be able to pursue different policies. And we've had particular rows over, like, you know, a bottle return scheme, etc., etc. And, you know, that's a feeling that's frankly shared across the devolved administrations, irrespective of partisanship. So to that extent, at least, devolution has probably been circumscribed to a degree. Now, Douglas Alexander has actually just started, and was it this week, either yesterday or the back end of last week, is now opening a consultation about whether or not the operation of the Single Market Act should be reviewed, with a view to perhaps reversing some of its more adverse effects and impact of devolution. So that's the story about devolution. Of course, there is now a much bigger point to make, at least so far as Scotland is concerned, which is that Brexit has fundamentally changed the character of support for independence, and also the debate and the intellectual question that would face Scotland if it were to have a referendum on independence while the rest of the UK is outside the European Union. Because essentially, I mean, whereas in 2014, despite all the rhetoric, there was no relationship between people's attitudes towards the European Union and whether they voted yes or no, in the wake of Brexit, people who are in favour of being inside the EU are more likely to be in favour of independence. So that's point one. And point two, the choice that Scotland would now face is, well, which do you think is in your interest? Being inside the UK but outside the EU, or inside the EU but outside the UK? Answers, please, on two sides of the way
By the end of the evening. Catherine is going to make the final remark, I think, because we are at time.
I was just going to say that the way that Theresa May and subsequently Boris Johnson treated the devolves was really quite shocking. It was a rampant disregard of their interests over Brexit and what the future relationship might look like. The fact that all of the devolves voted against all of the key pieces of EU legislation already indicated a great deal of dissatisfaction by the devolves. And what you saw is essentially muscular unionism by Boris Johnson, which led to the UK Internal Market Act that John has just been referring to, which borrowed bits and pieces from the EU notion, but in fact is actually very different in practice. And the very fact that come the first major test of the UK Internal Market Act, which is over the deposit return scheme of plastic bottles versus glass bottles, the Welsh want glass bottles to be included, has meant that the whole Act is being reviewed 6 months ahead of schedule, shows that what was going on before was clearly not working.
Yeah, it's not just the Welsh. I mean, the reason for the Scots scheme collapsing is because the Scots had wanted to include glass as well as plastic, and they were told they can't and stop it, so therefore the Scottish government caved in.
Well, it seems a good point at which to say don't leave your glasses under the seat or even your plastic bottles. It's been wonderful to share this evening with all of you. Thank you for all your questions, but thank you to our experts and our guests here this evening, John Curtice, Sarah Hall, Catherine Barnard and Anand Menon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.